Thank you. You'll notice that behind me it says the roots and fruits of cultural Marxism. There are no fruits of cultural Marxism. You'll see that the tree drops no fruits. It's always winter and it's never Christmas. It's a bit like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But the topic at hand, it really is the roots of cultural Marxism, and I'm going to talk to you about that. And I'm going to begin with a little bit of reminiscing, because I'm old enough, and I can see some of you are with me, but others are not, to remember the Cold War in person. And growing up in Canada, between the communist bloc and what was called at the time the free world. And in Canada, we tended to position ourselves in between those two, rather interestingly. So growing up in Canada in the 70s and the 80s, there was this odd tension, and the real threat, which is almost impossible for people to imagine now, of a global nuclear war. Lots of movies talked about it and so forth, but it was a real thing. I also remember while I was an undergrad watching the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and shortly thereafter I moved to Germany, and I lived with a fellow from East Germany who came across when the border opened suddenly. He was actually in Bulgaria, and he took his opportunity for freedom and fled to West Germany, as it was called at the time. And he spoke no English. He spoke Russian and Bulgarian in addition to German, because that was how different the two solitudes were at the time. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Eastern Bloc went with it, it meant that overnight the threat of communism seemed to evaporate. It was an extraordinary thing. I think most of us who grew up with the Cold War thought it was never going to end, and certainly if it was going to end, that it would not end so quickly, spectacularly, and almost bloodlessly. And by 1989, communism as an intellectual movement had failed clearly as a philosophy, and even in academia, it became very rare to meet somebody who was going to admit to being a Marxist. Although when I was in Germany, a friend of mine told me, he was a Russian historian, told me that in his Russian class where he was learning Russian, and they went around the room asking, why are you here to study Russian? One of an old guy said that he wanted to read Marx in the original. And if you didn't laugh, that's because you didn't realize that Marx wrote in German, and this was a German learning Russian in order to read Marx in the original, and of course Marx was a German. Anyway, poor guy. And that was a terrible joke. It fell flat. Anyway, I'm not here for the humor. At the time, there was an academic by the name of Francis Fukuyama, right at the end of the Cold War. And he wrote an essay just a few months after the Berlin Wall fell, and he called it The End of History. And he triumphalistically prophesied that, and I quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." And a conservative columnist by the name of George Will pronounced in Newsweek that the 60s are dead. So they both saw that the free world had triumphed. Communism was dead, and with it the sexual revolution. George Will also connects it. Very interesting, that latter connection. And it's absolutely true that as a political movement, the New Left of the 60s and the 70s, it collapsed along with the communists. So when Bill Clinton came to power, he really had to present himself as a conservative in many ways. If you are of that era that you remember Bill Clinton coming into office, he was on the conservative wing of the Democrat Party at the time. But the communist movement never went away, and they remained active, particularly in the universities. And they radicalized, and I would say they even metastasized what we would today call special interest groups. Now, some of the ways in which that was represented was obvious at the time, or at least in hindsight. We called it political correctness. So in the 1980s, political correctness was being introduced in universities, and we just basically mocked it and said, this is ridiculous. No matter who you were, it was pretty much, unless you were one of the people that were promoting it, it was a lot of eye rolling at this. But after that, the influence of political correctness gave way to other things. So if I use the word multiculturalism, or the word tolerance, or reproductive rights, or political correctness, or safe sex, or safe schools, or inclusive schools, or diversity, or sensitivity training, or social justice, and more recently BLM, or DEI, we would vaguely recognize that those are something to do with the agenda of the political left. Although, and in the latter two instances, BLM and DEI, we know that it's become part of the establishment because it's using three-letter acronyms now, which is what bureaucracies do. And really what they're doing is demonstrating power at this point. You know that you have to know what these letters connote. But we don't notice so much that it's with a political party because all the political parties refer to these terms. They use the terminology of inclusive schools and diversity, social justice. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left political wing or on the conservative political wing. And we're probably not going to find a source for these terms. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about. Now, I talked about this subject in public 10 years ago. My son had just been born. And as I say, it was 10 years ago. It's now up on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. And I call it Cultural Marxism and Social Justice. And at the time that I gave that lecture, Justin Trudeau was the leader of the opposition. And I was reading what he was saying, and I was listening to what he was saying, and I could see what was happening south of the border with Barack Obama. And I said to people, watch out, because what's coming here is not what you think is coming. And after 9 years in power, we can see that our Prime Minister has come to be seen as the figurehead of what is popularly called woke ideology. That was a term that didn't exist 9 years ago, 10 years ago. And in fact, Jordan Peterson recently wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph, the UK newspaper, that the West is sleepwalking into Trudeau's woke nightmare. This is in the UK paper, and Canada is being held up as the bastion of woke progressive ideals. And it's a global phenomenon. They're finding it in the UK, they're finding it all over Europe, they're finding it in the United States, they're finding it in South America. By and large, the only places that they're not finding it is in the Islamic world. And in the former Eastern Bloc, where they recognize communism when they see it. Now, I'm going to repeat some of what I said 10 years ago, because I think most people, first of all, didn't hear me speak, but secondly, I don't think people know the roots of cultural Marxism. They don't know the thinkers associated with it, what they had to say, and why that connects with what we call the woke agenda. So I want to talk about that this afternoon. Now, the cultural values embedded in the slogans I mentioned just a second ago, which now we associate with being woke, are just simply expressions of a complex and broad-ranging ideology called cultural Marxism. When I used this term 10 years ago, I think it was new to people. Now everyone knows this terminology. It's quite extraordinary. The reason I was acquainted with it is because one of my areas of academic expertise is in literary theory. And cultural Marxism is just one of the literary theories that was presented to me as a grad student over in England, and along with a lot of the other ideologies. Most of what is coming into the public square now in the legal system, in seminaries, pretty much everywhere, in med schools even, in universities, has come from my discipline of literary theory, which was mocked as a discipline even within English in the 1970s. Not that long ago, it was regarded as a suspicious discipline. Do we even need to study this? now everybody is using the terminology of the literary theorists. But it made an advance after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the reason it made an advance is because we let our guard down. And because columnists like George Will thought that the 60s are done. Francis Fukuyama thought this is the triumph of liberal democracy. It's great, the great dragon of the Soviet Union and all the communist proxies are gone. And so all that's left is the US and the free world. And so there will be an era of peace and order and good government. I think that was commonly believed. And there were no other viable threats at the time externally. But internally, it was not quite the same thing. And for that reason, it made advances. And it made advances even amongst those who call themselves conservatives. Precisely because they thought that communism was an ideology that related to economics. It was about money, it was capitalism versus communism, but it was an economic theory. It didn't have anything to do with culture per se. And so because of that, in their own teaching, their own political understanding, they dropped their guard because, of course, there were no economic threats to the West. There was no military threat anymore. And so communism was dead, wasn't it? Well, it was not so. And we now know it was not so because nobody can deny the influence of woke culture now, or cultural Marxism. It's being talked about all over the place. But the reason why it advanced is because culture was seen as, at best, a secondary matter of private opinion. You can have your private opinions on cultural matters, but when it comes to politics, we're going to debate about the matters of real substance, which is the economy. It's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton said at the time when he ran for office. It's the economy, stupid. He wrote it for himself. Talk about what the conservatives are talking about. You want to win, talk on their terms. And he did. But he advanced a socially liberal agenda along with it, the same thing that's happened here in our country, where conservatives have also run on a politically conservative or economically conservative platform, but will be happy to call themselves socially liberal and see no contradiction there because they're sticking with the facts. And the facts are connected with things that are objective, verifiable, on which people can't dispute. Whereas values are things about which we have subjective opinions and we can dispute those things. So you might call yourself a Christian, but you call yourself a Muslim. Those are things on which we can differ and we can agree to disagree. So as a political agenda to unite everybody, let's talk about the thing we have in common, and that's the financial issues. And so politicians, particularly in the light of multiculturalism in Canada, stopped talking about social issues and cultural issues. They just stopped talking about it. And so the advances of the left largely came because the conservatives swallowed the lie that communism was only ever an economic issue and not an issue of lordship over culture entirely. So we lost the culture war because we never fought a culture war. And this fact-value distinction goes all the way back to the Enlightenment period. It's a distinction that David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, makes. He says that science deals with objective facts. I hear this to this day, by the way. I grew up in science deals with objective facts. And things like the arts, I'm an English professor, or religious matters are values. You can talk about your Christian values, my musical tastes, are inherently subjective, and those are things on which we can agree to disagree. So it's the fact-value distinction that Hume introduces, and really so it's not just a 1960s problem, in other words, it's a deep-rooted Enlightenment problem. I'm going to say more about that in a second. But the consequence of this is what C.S. Lewis calls the abolition of man. Now, has everyone read this book? I suspect not. It's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask how many have read it. If you haven't read it, you must read it. This was written in 1943, and he argued in this, it was a series of 3 lectures which were later published, that public education had totally rejected the idea that mankind has a moral nature. and that education primarily involves cultivating that moral nature. Lewis observes in that work that, historically speaking, whether you were a pagan or a Christian, or any other religion for that matter, because he argues it's also true of Islam, it's true of Buddhism, it's true of every major religion, they will regard education as primarily cultivating the moral nature of the student. That's what education is. And he says if you remove that center from education, we no longer have education at all. You have propaganda. That's a pretty strong statement. But why does he say this? The reason he says it is because if there is no morality that objectively governs everybody who is being taught, then the teacher does not share something in common with the student, other than that the teacher is an authority, but neither of them are under a common view of goodness or evil, no common view of justice, because morality is a subjective thing. And if that is the case, then it entitles teachers to act upon their students in such a way that they're not morally accountable. Nor are they offending any laws by teaching their students as if they were patients or experimental objects. And that is exactly what Lewis said was going on in the education system. We are treating young people like they are poultry. We're not treating them like we're eagles and teaching them to fly. Here, I'm going to fly, follow my example, young bird. We're treating them like a poultry farmer treats a chicken. We're doing things to children that we would never do to ourselves. We've never done to ourselves. We're experimenting on them. That's what he alleges. And he says, and if you do that, now it's called the abolition of man. Most people, if you read critics on this, say it's the best defense of the moral law in the 20th century. Note that it's not called the abolition of the moral law. It's called the abolition of man, and for a very good reason, because this book argues that if we reject the idea that morality is central to human nature, then we will soon end up doing atrocious things to one another. We will do experiments on people. This is 1943, before the Auschwitz and all the horrors had been revealed. But also, it will give people in authority the carte blanche to do whatever they want to do with their fellow human beings. And it will lead to what I'm going to call is the outcome of this whole project, which is post-humanism, which just means that you can kill people without any moral reservation. It removes the intellectual objection to abusing other people. It means they have no rights or freedoms inherent to human nature. The concept of right is a moral object, right? The idea of freedoms has a moral connotation to it. It's not just freedom from a cage, it's freedom to do certain things, it's freedom from certain things. It has a moral aspect to it. And so Lewis's argument here is not just that if the public education has abandoned morality, it's moving into a different square. He's saying that it's going to lead to very terrible outcomes. And I think we can talk about that now more openly. I'm going to come back to that at the end here. But as a further consequence then, we get a shift from Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. You know Da Vinci from the famous Renaissance portraits. This is a sketch he made showing the arms of a man within a square and also within a circle. Moving from that sort of humanism where we rationally observe certain things about man and the whole universe, whoa, that went forward too quickly, to what we now call post-humanism. And this is a book by a contemporary literary theorist, Rosi Braidotti, in which she is showing us something of the future here, which is where there's no distinction between a human being and a machine. There's no distinction between a human being and the environment, where there's no distinction between a human being and an animal. It doesn't matter if it's an animal, a vegetable, a mineral, or if it's a non-living object. Effectively, it's all the same. It's the collapse of all categories. At which point, and this is a real literary tendency, by the way, and it's very strong. Post-humanism in universities is the next big thing. I talked about cultural Marxism 10 years ago. I'm talking to you about post-humanism right now. And I'll also talk to you about transhumanism, because you know all about that. And I keep hearing amongst Christians that transhumanism is the next thing. That's 20 years ago as well. Transhumanism is alive and well. It's Silicon Valley. It's all over the place. You're right. But posthumanism is upon us, and I'm not hearing anybody talk about it. So I'm going to talk about it, but I'm here to talk about cultural Marxism and how it bleeds into that. That's where we're going to go here. So where does this dynamic originate? The appeal to cultural Marxism. Why do people buy cultural Marxism? Why do people buy collectivist views of human nature? Well, in my opinion, it's because we've made a significant shift culturally over the course of a long period of time. I'm not going to lecture on this too much. I just want to drop it as a point in the background and illustrate it with a couple of paintings. This is from Rembrandt, The Prodigal Son, the famous one in which the father greets his son. The son's repenting of his prodigality, wasting his inheritance and so forth. He begs his father back for forgiveness, and his father receives him with love, puts on the signet ring, puts on his cloak, etc. You know the famous picture, but it's a beautiful painting here. This is from Rembrandt. It's his view of human nature. It's because, remember, in the parable, The Prodigal Son, the father represents God. And we represent that boy turned towards the father, being received by his embrace there. That's the portrait of humanity of Rembrandt in the late 17th century. Scroll forward to 1818. This is from Caspar David Friedrich. And this is the portrait of human nature that I'm going to submit to you we still operate with implicitly. Because what we see here is a man looking out into a horizon, his back turned to the viewer. Note you don't see his face. You see his back. And is it in fact a man? It might be, it might not be. I think it probably is a man. But could be anybody else for that matter. We don't see his face. What we see is him looking into the distance, into a sublime landscape. It's a landscape of grandeur. He's at the top of a mountain. He's like a progressive. He's on the pinnacle of culture, looking out into the sublime landscape and getting a sense of the awe of nature, which he beholds as an aspect of his consciousness. He sees that awesomeness. He is irrelevant in the picture. It's the perspective where we're not part of the picture. It's looking out. We don't see his face. We see what he sees. This is the way we look at the world. When we want to see human nature, what do we see? Do we see the Trinity? Do we see three persons as an aspect of human nature? Remember, we bear the image of God. Do we see persons when we want to portray that? Do we see the family? Do we see communities? Do we see the church? No, we see this type of individual. His back turned to us, looking where we look. And so when we think of our own humanity, we think of ourselves looking out at things. We don't even see ourselves. And this gets represented in a literary fashion in the ideal of literature from this period onward. It's called the orphan. From this period onward, every major literary enterprise, and going from Charles Dickens onwards, will have an orphan as his hero. And I could list them for you, but you could look at Anne of Green Gables even. But you can move into the superhero fiction of the Marvel universe, where they're all orphans. You could look at James Bond. You could look at Harry Potter. You could basically run off the list. The Walt Disney films are full of orphans. Begs the question, because before this period, you will notice that there are almost no orphans in literature, and if they're in there, they're not heroes. They're never heroes, whereas here they are heroes. How come? Because this is a paradigm for us to follow, to think about it for ourselves. Apply it to yourself. Think of yourself as an orphan. Imagine that you have no parents. Imagine that there's no governing order over you. Imagine that you have to create the world for yourself, like this man looking out into the background. That's the way you're to look at the world. Create the world in accordance with how you wish it to be. That's how you will do that. It's to some degree recapitulating the original sin. You shall be as gods, determining good and evil. You're determining that for yourself. That gets presented in Western literature here. And the reason why this is relevant is once you remove the idea of human nature being anything other than what I determine for myself, I'm a self-interpreting orphan, everything else evaporates. And once all that you have left is this autonomous individual, what you need is community. You need an identity. And how do you identify yourself then? Well, in accordance with your whatever you choose, quite frankly. It's the opening for Marxism to slide in. Remember, Marxism is all about class warfare, different groups, the bourgeoisie, the working class, the proletariat, the masters, the slaves, whatever, different identity groups warring against each other. We can reconfigure that in accordance with different types of identity groups if we choose, and we do in fact do that. But the reason why it's effective, by the way, and liberal democracy bleeds into the tyrannies of Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and Mao, is because the individual autonomously conceived lacks something essential to human nature, which is community. We lack that and we need it. And if we don't have anything that we recognize as definitive of our human nature, like a family, or like a church, or like a work guild, like a society that we belong to, if those are not part of our human nature, then we're going to find ourselves running towards collectivism. And we'll find identity in the huge group, and it pushes us towards communism, right? That's what lies behind the push towards communism. And eventually, when people think of themselves as orphans in this fashion, then they're willing to do what happened with COVID-19. They're willing to put masks on themselves because they see themselves without a face anyway. What's the difference? Some people wouldn't know tyranny if it covered their faces, locked them in their homes, enacted the biggest wealth transfer in history, censored them, made them show papers, and force medicated them. That's not tyranny, that's protection. Who's protecting me? The state. The state gives me my protection, it gives me my identity, I'm going to go along with the group. The reason why this has been effective is because we've been sold a lie for a long time about human identity. And the communists first come in and make hay with it, and then the cultural Marxists do more things and warp it in terms of identity politics, about which I'll talk in a minute. But Christians have capitulated on this largely because they've capitulated on the idea of Christ's lordship over all of life. Not just over your soul's salvation, about your personal relationship with Christ, but about the way in which God ordains the whole world, in which he speaks quite definitively in Scripture. The importance of the family as the basic fundamental human unit, not the state, but the family. The nature of the church as the new family of God, where you can be related to people by creed and not by blood. In national identities and so forth. By the way, it's not accidental that along with post-humanism, we have post-nationalism, and that our dear Prime Minister talked explicitly about that right away. Most people didn't pick up on that. They thought, what a foolish thing, but we find that post-nationalism is also the flavor of the month. Well, as I say, Christians have ignored their own inheritance here, and we need to recover it. Now, the best way to do this, it seems to me, is to take the whole canon of God. My old pastor in the UK used to say it takes a whole Bible to preach a whole Christ to make whole Christians. A whole Bible to preach a whole Christ to make whole Christians. And to make whole Christians, you need to include a Christ that includes the kingdom over which he's king. Christians live in this world. The kingdom of God is among us. We're in the kingdom of God now. Not fully, not finally, but we're surely in the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is not just a relationship of this guy with no identity to God. It's certainly not this one. It's one where we have personal, interactive relationships of love, and those spread out, and they create thick, important communities. No, a good place to begin is my friend Vishal Mangalwadi. If you haven't seen this book, I recommend it to you, The Book That Made Your World, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. Very interesting. The reason it's helpful is that Vishal is an Indian. He grew up in a country that was not Christianized, and so he realized that he migrated to America, and he realized that what Americans and Canadians regarded as common sense is not common sense at all. It's just the product of the culture that they grew up in. And the reason that he could see this is because he grew up in a country that didn't have those things. So things that we took for granted and we're starting to lose with great rapidity, things like free speech, property rights, the idea that there's a universal human equality, the idea that there ought to be a separation of powers, the judiciary from the politicians, the different branches of government, the independence of the judiciary, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, the idea that we owe a duty of care to the poor, the sick, the insane, etc. These are all legacies of Christendom. He sees it clearly because he's been in a place where it didn't have it. We're now becoming the place where we no longer are going to have it for much longer, because we have acted as if this were true of our human nature. And whenever you have a certain basic concept of your own identity, everything else is going to conform to it. So everything that is non-essential to this portrait of yourself is going to go away and be actually antithetical to this identity. So you're going to rebel against your family. You're going to rebel against your church. You're going to rebel against your nationhood. You're going to rebel against anything that will stand in the way of your ideal view of your own self. A faceless, looking into the horizon self. And what we get out of this also, and this was particularly clear in COVID, is the boundaries between public and private are also evaporating. Thanks to digital monitoring, the public square is now in your home. It follows you everywhere on your smartphone. Not only can we see the world through it, the world can see us. And so this breaches an ancient, sacred realm, actually, of the private sphere over which previous generations, even the pagans, would never have intruded on a home. Whereas now the government feels that it's justified in doing so, and it will do so, because it has abrogated or arrogated for itself totalitarian powers, because, again, it's there to protect the individual. Individuals who have no identity are going to be given an identity. So, COVID happened, the lockdowns happened, the atrocities of the lockdown happened, families cut off from their families, people locked out of their churches, people willingly complying, doctors refusing to follow the Nuremberg Code, and the one sole ethical, recognized ethical standard of the Western world, which is the right to informed consent, that went out the window under COVID. So there are no ethics left, if that's the case. You can't go back once you've done that. Not without a reckoning. There has to be a reckoning. If you have thrown out your sole ethical restraint in the name of fear, what will make us trust you that you won't do something the same or worse next time? Nothing. You can't trust people that reject their own ethical standards. So this is not a trivial thing I'm talking about. And we've entered a new age of a new fundamentalism. And it is symptomatic of the problem that it is yet to be acknowledged, and yet it is so. So an age that prizes itself, as ours does, on being accepting and tolerance, is clearly the least able to identify contradictions to its own confirmation bias. We're accepting, we're tolerant, we allow for everything. But I'm telling you that what we find in our own day, and I don't think I need to persuade you because you will recognize this yourselves, is that we are intensely intolerant of everything but tolerance. And what we mean by tolerance is very different than what was meant by tolerance when I grew up. And I'm going to come to that in a second. That's a very important aspect of cultural Marxism. And the only thing that can throw out the old fundamentals, and when I say the old fundamentals, the markers of human nature and the Christian society that Vishal Mangawati identifies for us, the only thing that can replace that fundamental notion of human nature, and everybody used to believe those things, by the way, left and right. They would believe in the freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right? All of those freedoms and certain rights, the right to a fair trial, the universal human nature. Everyone bears the image of God. They might not use that language, but they'll say that everybody has rights. It doesn't matter if they're male or female, black or white. We all believe in that, don't we? Well, now we don't. Not anymore. The only thing that can throw out those fundamentals is a new fundamentalism. You can't expel it by anything less powerful than a new fundamentalism. And the fact that it's religious in nature is revealed by the fact that an established Christian right central to the faith, such as marriage, has been redefined and is more inclusive. Now, if you include something in a definition, you don't hold on to the old definition. You can't. You've changed the definition, so it's no longer marriage. Now, we can say that Christians still have marriage, and of course they do, but from the state's perspective is what I mean. The state now calls things marriage that are no longer marriage and confuses the categories, which is again characteristic of the literary theorists of our day who don't think that words mean anything. What we mean is what we tell you we mean, which is not what we've said. If you want to figure out what I mean, I'm going to show you what I mean, but you can't argue about it. 10 years ago, I said that we could see it in marriage. Now there are a few other things that we can find have also changed along with marriage, and that is the family. In Ontario law, it's been redefined. Did you know that? I fought it, just like in the sex ed. I wrote in the papers about it. I think most people didn't even register it. But in Ontario law, the words father and mother, no, they don't exist. Did you know that? And so is the human person, for that matter. Now we talk about various identities. And we've noticed, if you have followed it, that the pride flag, which was waved in the mid-70s, is still being waved, but the flag has changed in accordance with all the identities that have sprung up in the wake of it. And these are now being promoted in the name of inclusion and diversity, which begs the question of whether they weren't diverse before. But I guess diversity is an endless, there is no end to the diversity and there's no end to the inclusion. Now, if you think about the moral consequences of that, if everything must be included, then evil as well as good must be included, and right and wrong. And in fact, that is exactly what's going on here. We have a blurring of categories between what is considered to be sacred and what is considered to be abhorrent, what is considered to be just and what is considered to be unjust. All of those things are going to be included in one category for the sake of diversity and inclusion and equity, DEI. Now you can also present it on a social A and call it BLM as well, but really it's DEI that's governing the space. And so what I want to do here, and I think this slide shows the flags which you've noticed are being flown from public schools. You might not see the Canadian flag, you won't see the Ontario flag, but you will see these flags in public buildings. I don't recall the nation of whatever that flag represents being proclaimed anywhere, but that's what a flag does. It's a colonization. It's exactly what's happened. Talk about colonialism. This is the new colonialism. Who voted for this party? The party that promotes this? There is no party that promotes it. They all promote it, actually. They all talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Nobody speaks against it. Let me backtrack a little bit. I'll need to get on my bike here a little bit. This was the Paris Olympics 2024. It was a mockery of the Last Supper by Da Vinci, by the way. Did you see this? This man in the background here with the beard on and so forth. It was all sort of a satanic parody. Let me backtrack a bit. As most people know, Marx and his followers believed that there would be that the basic struggle was over material goods. And the problem was that some people had too much and some people had too little, and eventually the workers would overthrow the wealthy and they would seize the means of production, and we'd bring about the new communist paradise. And they thought that this would happen at the next big world war. And in World War I, the World War happened, and there was no revolution, other than in Russia, which contradicted what Marx thought. Marx thought it was going to happen in Britain. The most civilized nations would progress to the next stage of human development. And in fact, it happened in the most backward area of Europe, in Russia at the time. And this really frustrated the Marxists. And they lost a lot of sleep over it. And they realized that the working classes were never going to rise up against the aristocrats, the wealthy, and they puzzled. Why is this? Why are they not seeing that what we're proposing is good for them? And they realized the reason why is because the people, even the working class, were invested in the social fabric, and they didn't want to break up the social fabric because they realized it was going to destroy their families. And it would destroy all law and order. And it would destroy everything that kept their nation a place that they loved. Yes, they might hate their boss, but they weren't going to burn the whole civilization to the ground to get it. And that's what was entailed. And so the cultural Marxists realized that what they had to do is to change the tune on Marxism. And they did it in what we call cultural Marxism. So it's no longer an economic revolution. It is presented in an indirect fashion. Now, there are two thinkers that I'm going to speak about briefly that present this indirect threat. One's name is Antonio Gramsci, Italian, and the other is Georg Lukács, Hungarian. And they concluded that it was the Christianized West that stood in the way of worldwide communism and the social justice that it represented. And Gramsci noted that Christianity had been dominant in the West for 2 millennia. It wasn't just that the bourgeoisie were tied to the church, the middle classes. It was interwoven throughout Western law. It was in the political structures, the separations of powers, like I talked about. It was even in the mindset of the working class. Gramsci regarded them as their enemy. The working class, that's not my enemy. My enemy is the people I've just fought against that are going to invade my nation. My enemy is not the aristocrats. I may not like them, but I'm not going to go to war, a civil war internally. No thanks. So Gramsci identified the real problem was the Christian worldview that had been infused, and that had to be subverted. The reason it succeeded, as I say, is because underlying all that was this. Collectivism was always waiting there. There was a very weak individualism there that could be preyed upon. Now, Gramsci and the other cultural Marxists concluded that the West would have to be de-Christianized, not by violent revolution, but more slowly through what he called the long, slow march through the institutions. And so as to fundamentally rework the culture and turn it against the Christian faith. And that's what they then proceeded to do. And the history of the 20th century is largely the slow collapse of the liberal, progressive, secular worldview in the face of cultural Marxism. So the narrative starts getting taken over. This will fit the liberal progressive worldview. We're on top of the mountain. We've triumphed, just like Francis Fukuyama. It's the end of history. Hurrah. The Marxists are still working. And they're working in a way that is insidious and unexpected. They think the enemy is external. The enemy's talking about economics. No, the enemy's talking about culture. And they always have been, and they still are. They construct this wheel of privilege and power. I'll put another one up in a moment. But for the cultural Marxists, every formative cultural institution, starting with the family, but including the schools, the media, the arts, civic organization, churches, the legal profession, and the methodology of every academic discipline, the understanding of human nature has to be brought on board. And so they get to work in all of these areas. all of them. And so it's a slow permeation, drip by drip, such that it doesn't even seem like it's a threat, but slowly the academy gets taken over from within. And what has to happen is what Friedrich Nietzsche calls the transvaluation of all value. What Christianity exalts must become deplorable. What Christianity deplores must be exalted. What's good has to become evil. What's evil has to become good. And furthermore, the people who do this, the proletariat, the working class, they have to be reimagined, because the working class are not doing what they're told here. They don't realize how progressive we are. They're not on board with this. How do we reimagine the proletariat? Well, rather than the working man, who's too much tied to his family and his country, Gramsci argues that a new proletariat will have to be created, and he includes criminals, he includes women, he includes racial minorities amongst them. And the even more influential Hungarian writer Georg Lukács agrees with him, and through a program he calls cultural terrorism, he includes radical sex education into Hungarian schools. And Lukács recognizes that by attacking Christian sexual ethics, he would be able to undermine the family. And with it, the Christian faith. And another really good book, I don't have a slide for it, by a woman sociologist by the name of Mary Eberstadt, wrote a book called How the West Really Lost God, and she points that it's only through the attack on the family combined with attacks on Christian doctrine that the Christian faith ultimately collapsed. Because liberals have been trying to destroy Christian doctrine for a long time. It didn't work. You recognize them for what they are. I mean, it had some effect, but it didn't destroy the family. Whereas this, the combination of the two does. And it's why, by the way, in our day, that Christianity is now largely a middle-class phenomenon. As pathetic and tragic as that is, it's because those middle classes largely have intact families. That's the sad reality. And very wealthy people hold on to their families because they recognize when you break the family, they break themselves. And so we're not going to do that. You have to have a lot of money to be able to afford to break your family. Anyway, next group, the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School began in, as you might think, Frankfurt, Germany. And in 1923 during a Marxist study week. And it's the originator of what we call political correctness and the idea of multiculturalism. So it's not a Canadian invention. It's something invented 1920s, 1930s. It drew a variety of writers together that I'm not going to mention here for lack of time. One of them, though, his name is Wilhelm Reich. He coins the term the sexual revolution. When does he do it? 1936. Sexual revolution. And another writer by the name of Herbert Marcuse, who I am going to talk about now, expands Gramsci's new proletariat to include homosexuals, lesbians, and transsexuals as well. And he adopts Lukács's radical sex ed and cultural terrorism tactics to promote it as well. And now we have what we recognize as a sexual revolution in the 1960s. By the way, in the 1960s, the radicals used to call out Marx, Mao, Marcuse. They mentioned Marcuse. People have forgotten about Marcuse, but he was right alongside Marx and Mao. And the influence of this didn't stay restricted to Germany because the cultural Marxists were driven out of Germany by Hitler, and they fled to America. And that's where they took seed. And that's a really interesting thing, and I've puzzled much about that. But it seems to me this push of cultural Marxism into the West, where this idea of autonomous human nature reigns, is a form of the Lord's judgment even upon Christians who've lost the goodness of Trinitarian personal theology, who've lost the goodness of the family, who've lost the goodness of the church in its full-orbed, God-ordained biblical mandate. That's how it seems to me. I can find no better reason. I'm speculating, though, so who knows? What we do know is that the cultural Marxist, the Frankfurt School, moves to America, and there it sets in. And there it starts to influence Hollywood and the media, It influences studies in prejudice. So Theodore Adorno writes a book called, this is not moving for some reason. Theodore Adorno writes a book called The Authoritarian Personality, and he creates an F scale. The F scale is degrees of fascism, and he attributes it to Christian families. So if you are a traditional family and you regard the father to have governance over the household, Adorno will call you a fascist. You wonder why Christians are called fascists now? It's a long-standing use of fascism associated with the authoritarian personality. So anyone under the sway of political correctness will call his or her opponents, if they appeal to the Christian notion of the family or Christian sexual ethics, they will be called fascists. It's not a new charge. 1950, Theodore Adorno, The Authoritarian Personality. In critical theory, we start to see it in forms of studies, and these proliferate in the universities. We've got cultural studies, women's studies, Aboriginal studies, African American studies, LGBT studies, post-colonial studies. All of these areas that we call studies are basically cultural Marxist hotbeds where they proliferate and metastasize. And now they tend to take over departments. Like the English departments are largely cultural studies departments. In fact, you often see them being presented that way. Finally, they express itself in terms of domination. Now, Marx argues that history is economically determined. Those who own the means of production have the power, and they determine the course of society. But the Frankfurt School reimagines the proletariat and argues that history is not determined by economics, it's determined by identity group. And whatever identity group you want, and I can't get this thing to work, that's really frustrating, to push it on. But whatever group you define here, whether it's male group or female group, it's black group, it's white group, it's religious group, it's irreligious, it's gay, it's straight, whatever the group is a form of hierarchy. Let me see if I can do this way. I can. Aren't I clever? No, but it worked. In the academic wheel of privilege, privilege is in the center, less privilege is the categories are on the very outside. As you get closer to the center of the privilege, you get this intersectional identity. And in accordance with your group, you will either be closer to power or away from power, but everything in life is now determined not by money, but by power. Power becomes the dominant discussion point in academia because of the cultural Marxists. It's all about power. It's particularly in the writing of Michel Foucault, where they talk about power. Now let me finally talk about Herbert Marcuse. His chief work is Eros and Civilization, which is a hybrid of Marxist and Freudian teaching, which, as I say, leans on Wilhelm Reich's sexual revolution. But he says that it's a new paradise where there was only play and no work. And he said we can only get to that paradise where there's only play and no work if we liberate non-procreative Eros through what he calls polymorphous perversity. In other words, he is making an assault on the common sense of the family and sexual ethics. And he destigmatizes every sexual expression except heterosexual marital relations. And you can see this portrayed in films all the time. Every sexual proclivity is being either soft-shoed or strongly promoted except heterosexual marital relations. Every hero is an orphan. Where does an orphan come from? I don't know my mother and father. Precisely. And that doesn't matter. You are who you are. You have to look within inside yourself to find your identity. Peter Parker, Bruce Wayne, you name it. And those that hold to a biblical view are going to be called sexually repressed and stigmatized and prejudiced and evil and, of course, fascist. And with this coalition of identities, we get the foundation for the New Left. And the New Left now unites the different groups in this on the outside of the circle and says, here's our common enemy. The common enemy is what? Christian human nature, Christian notions of a free society, Christian virtue, Christian morality, Christian notions of freedom, separations of power. All those things are under assault. And one of them, George Weinberg, coins the word homophobia in 1967. First time. It's a phobia now. It's a fear. Now, the common complaint on university campuses is that Christian sexual ethics are heteronormative. That's just Marxism. This is a Marxist terminology. Now, the best way this works, and this is the most effective play of all, Marcuse realizes that the real fundamental liberal value that stands in his way is the very thing that defines the liberal order of this guy. Tolerance. He says tolerance is the real problem, because tolerance still assumes everything that Vishal Mangalwadi said was characteristic of Western culture. Freedoms, rights, what marriage is, treatment towards others, the idea that everyone is equally human, that they have rights before the law, they're innocent till proven guilty. And tolerance, all the people who claim to be tolerant on the left and the right are going to agree on those things, but we want them to disagree on those things. So we have to introduce a new idea of tolerance, and the way we're going to do it is to call the old-fashioned tolerance repressive tolerance. And we're going to call the new tolerance liberating tolerance. And so he proceeds with this, because he thinks that our democracy was rooted in an intolerance towards things that were outside that Christian foundation. And of course, they were. And so he says what we need to do is realize the objective of tolerance by calling for intolerance towards prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerances to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. So we need to create a war, literally, in the political square, where your opponents on the other side of the political aisle, if you're in Parliament, are not your opponents, they're your enemies. We're not Her Majesty's government. We represent this political party. We represent this group. These are literally inhuman. The people you're against are repugnant. And you've noticed that Parliament has descended into not only distasteful language, but it's disgusting. And there's no public debate. In universities, people decry it. People old enough to have been around to have seen something different. It doesn't matter who it is. They speak in dehumanizing language towards one another. It's contemptuous. It's terrible. Sort of like what Tony was talking about earlier, except now it's on within the ranks of the allegedly civilized, the allegedly civilized West. And Marcuse says this: it is necessary to break the established universe of meaning and the practice enclosed in this universe in order to enable man to find out what is true and false, to become truly autonomous. Autonomous, oh, you mean like the guy looking into the horizon? Yes, to be truly autonomous, to find by themselves what is true and what is false for man in the existing society. They will have to be freed from the prevailing indoctrination, which is no longer recognized as indoctrination. And so what he does is exactly do this. He creates a new notion of tolerance that is intensely intolerant. And we've seen it play out now, and I've got a few slides here that will just illustrate from the time I first gave this lecture in 10 years to what happens now. This is from the actual Toronto Catholic District School Board. This is October month. The whole month is LGBT History Month throughout the US and Canada. On the 8th, there's International Lesbian Day. Well, I don't need to read it for you. But these are all recognized days. They're part of the count. Well, these are holy days. It's a new religion. Of course. One school was so foolish to say life does not come with a manual, it comes with a mom. The protests were so loud that they had to take the sign down. What's offensive about saying on Mother's Day that life comes from mom? I mean, it's simplistic, but still, what's offensive about it? Well, I think you can guess. I mean, it's not offensive, but again, the practice of the tolerance brigade is to attack anything that suggests an order that they don't determine. And so liberating tolerance is actually the most intolerant form of all rights, of all things. And Marcuse says that tolerance is an end in itself. The elimination of violence and the reduction of suppression to the extent required for protecting man and animals from cruelty and aggression are preconditions for the creation of a human society. And so he thinks that all laws are just violence. We got to get rid of all laws. We have to include everything. And until then, we will accept a society that's violent, and that society cannot be tolerated. So what we have here in the name of peace, inclusion, diversity, equity is war under the umbrella of peace. And what it results in, ultimately, is a war on humanity, post-humanism. Because, of course, it's said that our carbon footprints are destroying the planet, that we're suppressing life. Now, life, remember when Marx says, or Marcuse rather, says that we have to get rid of the protection of man and animals from cruelty or aggression, is he's now equivocating man and animals. So anywhere there's oppression, we have to get rid of that. Anywhere where there's laws that will determine that killing an animal is different than killing a human being, we have to get rid of that. Well, it doesn't protect the animals, it's open season on human beings. That's what it means. And that agenda is being played out in the UN Agenda 2030, which is a agenda. It calls itself for sustainable development. The way you sustain the development is by reducing carbon footprints, greenhouse gases. How do you do that? Post-humanism. That's how. I'm done. I went over my time, so that's why I stopped. I got lots to say. Do you have any questions? Yeah? I realize we're done.
That's okay. If you wanna,
does anyone want to have a yeah. Yes, sir.
well, go ahead, or I can keep going. So, post-humanism is the realization of humanism. Would that be correct?
The new humanism, which is a self-defined autonomous humanism. I'm really trying not to confuse people here. Oh yeah, this is PETA, right? The animal rights organization. Extraordinary. Note that PETA, for some reason, has this flag in the background. It's from their own website. I mean, you would think it was a joke. It looks like a satire site, but it's not. That's why Babylon Bee is so popular. Right? It's like, oh, this. If you don't realize it, you think, oh, this has just happened. And like, no, oh, that's a satire.
One more?
Yes, one more, sure. At the back, I saw a hand. You, sir? No? Okay. Oh, there you go. Yes, sir. Long, slow march through the institutions, yes? Through academic studies, through theoretical perspectives that will dispute the terms of engagement, and among other things will dispute the idea that truth is a determination, or truth or falsehood is a determination on the relevance or the utility of an argument, or moral aspects to it. So you can propose as something intensely immoral, like the idea that abortion and euthanasia ought to be permitted in the name of compassion. You can present that as an academic argument. Okay, well, once you do that and you get pushback, then you get all sorts of papers being written on it, and then you can get an institution of people that believe the view hostile to human nature, and they produce papers, and eventually academia will reward them all equally because it doesn't want to discriminate between the different parties, and it will just give funding to it. Well, eventually, if you get enough of that intruding in the academy, and truth is no longer the determination of whether something is academically respectable, you can get that in every discipline. It starts in the universities, filters down to the schools, goes into the legal profession, goes into the medical profession, goes into the sporting arena. It's all over the place. You can't stop it in that sense. Once you admit falsehood into the academy as having equal treatment with truth, and you can no longer use logic to refute positions, then the academic endeavor is devastated. And now I realize that this has practical implications, but the real battleground, as it was ever since the day of the Reformation, is in the universities. It has to be. That's where it's everywhere, of course, but that's where truth and falsehood are contended. Anyway, I can talk to you about it afterwards. I've overshot my time. Thank you, everyone.